Counter Narrative News bringing you a special episode of a series of episodes on revolutionaries from South Africa. Today, on this day, back in 1960, that's the 21st of March 1960, the Sharpeville Massacre took place. Sharpeville was a township in which the white supremacist apartheid regime in South Africa at the time basically forced 10,000 black African people to live in this township. And they also had this thing called the pass laws, where basically they were controlling the movement of black working class people in South African apartheid. And the African National Congress and also the Pan-African Congress, the two leading liberation resistance movements in South Africa, were planning a protest against the pass laws. Robert Sobukwe, the leader of the Pan-African Congress, the PAC, took the initiative in this protest and started mobilizing the people. So thousands of black people turned up at the police station in Sharpeville, and through the day that turned into 15,000 and then 20,000. They were all unarmed. The only weapons they had, if you can call it that, were stones. And then the massacre took place, in which hundreds were injured, 69 people were killed, including 8 women and 10 children. What followed from that, it was an insurrectionary type of resistance moment. And then the 1960s after that, so remember the Sharpeville Massacre takes place on 21st of March 1960, and the 60s becomes a very repressive decade. The liberation organizations are banned, and radicalizes. We're talking about the 1960s, which is the most radical moment probably of any moment of the history of humanity, whereby the forces of anti-colonial radical socialist grassroots across the world are just forging together. The leaderships all around the world are fusing in unity, ideologically and practically, and the same thing, the radicalization is happening in South Africa, and this cross-fertilization of radicalization as well, from between continents, between states, between struggles, is all happening, including in South Africa. And so by the end of the 1960s, in this period of radicalization, Steve Biko, and we're going to focus on this episode on Steve Biko, forms the South African Student Organization, which is developing a kind of revolutionary black consciousness around the framework of Malcolm X's Black Revolution, as explained in his message to the grassroots. And SASO, this South African Students Organization, really helps to radicalize and give confidence to the black grassroots. And that leads to another wave of militancy and a wave of resistance by the late 60s into the 70s. Now, Steve Biko and SASO and his black consciousness movement really emphasize mass work in the townships, really emphasizing that it has to be concrete things done with the revolutionary ideology in serving the masses. And this is an absolute fundamental primary thing of any radical revolutionary movement anywhere in the world, in history or today. And then what happens through the 70s is that Steve Biko in March 1973 receives a banning order from the apartheid regime himself, and he's unable to conduct his movements and his political organizing. And then there's the Soweto uprising from the 16th of 18th of June 1976, in which the liberation movements mobilize school children and those in education in protest against the apartheid language as a form of Dutch, Afrikaans, being the medium of education for black children in South Africa. People rose up against this, and this led to, in the Soweto uprising, of around 176 to 700 people killed by the apartheid regime. On 12th of September 1977, Steve Biko himself is martyred. He dies in police custody, dying after torture when he defied his banning order, actually, and he was traveling around to meet his comrades and conduct his political activity. So here we're going to just share a section from this book of Steve Biko's collection of his writings. It's the most famous collection of his writings. It's called I Write What I Like. It's a beautiful edition, actually, published by Bowdene Press in 1978. A gorgeous book. And so it's called, it's on chapter 9, The Definition of Black Consciousness. It says, this is a paper produced for a SASO leadership training course probably in December 1971, and is included here as an example of Steve talking to members of his own organisation and therefore speaking from the heart of his and their experience. So, quote, the definition of black consciousness. We have in our policy manifesto defined blacks as those who are by law or tradition politically, economically, or socially discriminated against as a group in South African society and identifying themselves as a unit in the struggle towards the realization of their aspirations. This definition illustrates to us a number of things. One, being black is not a matter of pigmentation. Being black is a reflection of a mental attitude. Two, merely by describing yourself as black, you have started on a road towards emancipation. You have committed yourself to fight against all forces that seek to use your blackness as a stamp that marks you out as a subservient being. From the above observations, therefore, we can see that the term black is not necessarily all-inclusive, i.e. the fact we are all not white does not necessarily mean that we are all black. Non-whites do exist and will continue to exist for quite a long time. If one's aspirations is whiteness, but his pigmentation makes attainment of this impossible, then that person is a non-white. Any man who calls a white man Bas, any man who serves in the police force or security branch is ipso facto a non-white. Black people, real black people, are those who manage to hold their heads high in defiance rather than willingly surrender their souls to the white man. Briefly defined, therefore, black consciousness is in essence the realization by the black man of the need to rally together with his brothers around the cause of their operation, the blackness of their skin, and to operate as a group in order to rid themselves of the shackles that bind them to perpetual servitude. It seeks to demonstrate the lie that black is an aberration from the normal, which is white. It is a manifestation of a new realization that by seeking to run away from themselves and to emulate the white man, blacks are insulting the intelligence of whoever created them black. Black consciousness, therefore, takes cognizance of the deliberateness of God's plan in creating black people black. It seeks to infuse the black community with a newfound pride in themselves, their efforts, their value systems, their culture, their religion, and their outlook to life. The interrelationship between consciousness of the self and the emancipatory program is of paramount importance. Blacks no longer seek to reform the system because doing so implies acceptance of the major points around which the system revolves. Blacks are out to completely transform the system and to make of it what they wish. Such a major undertaking can only be realized in an atmosphere where people are convinced of the truth inherent in their stand. Liberation, therefore, is of paramount importance in the concept of black consciousness, for we cannot be conscious of ourselves and yet remain in bondage. We want to attain the envisioned self, which is a free self. The surge towards black consciousness is a phenomenon that has manifested itself throughout the so-called Third World. There is no doubt that discrimination against the black man the world over fetches its origin from the exploitative attitude of the white man. Colonization of white countries by whites has throughout history resulted in nothing more sinister than mere cultural or geographical fusion at worst, or language bastardization at best. It is true that the history of weaker nations is shaped by bigger nations. But nowhere in the world today do we see whites exploiting whites on a scale even remotely similar to what is happening in South Africa. Hence, one is forced to conclude that it's not coincidence that black people are exploited. It was a deliberate plan which has culminated in even so-called black independent countries not attaining any real independence. With this background in mind, we are forced therefore to believe that there is a case of haves against have-nots, where whites have been deliberately made haves and blacks have-nots. There is, for instance, no worker in the classical sense among whites in South Africa, for even the most downtrodden white worker still has a lot to lose if the system is changed. He is protected by several laws against competition at work from the majority. He has a vote and he uses it to return the nationalist government to power because he sees in them as the only people who, through job reservation laws, are bent on looking after his interest against competition with the natives. It should therefore be accepted that an analysis of our situation in terms of one's colour at once takes care of the greatest single determinant for political action, i.e. colour, while also validly describing the blacks as the only real workers in South Africa. It immediately kills all suggestions that there could ever be effective rapport between the real workers, i.e. blacks, and the privileged white workers, since we have shown that the latter are the greatest supporters of the system. True enough, the system has allowed so dangerous an anti-black attitude to build up amongst whites that it's taken as almost a sin to be black, and hence the poor whites who are economically nearest to the blacks demonstrate the distance between themselves and the blacks by an exaggerated reactionary attitude towards blacks. Hence the greatest anti-black feelings to be found amongst the very poor whites, whom the class theory calls upon to be with the black workers in the struggle for emancipation. This is the kind of twisted logic that the black consciousness approach seeks to eradicate. In terms of the black consciousness approach, we recognize the existence of one major force in South Africa. This is white racism. It is the one force which all of us are pitted. It works with unnerving totality, featuring both an offensive and in our defense. Its greatest ally to date has been the refusal by us to club together as blacks because we are told to do so would be racialist. So while we progressively lose ourselves in a world of colourlessness and amorphous common humanity, whites are deriving pleasure and security in entrenching white racism and further exploiting the minds and bodies of the unsuspecting black masses. Their agents are ever present among us, telling us that it is immoral to withdraw into a cocoon, that dialogue is the answer to our problem, that it's unfortunate that there is white racism in some quarters, but you must understand that things are changing. These in fact are the greatest racists, for they refuse to credit us with any intelligence to know what we want. Their intentions are obvious. They want to be barometers by which the rest of white society can measure feelings in the black world. This then is what makes us believe that the white power presents itself as a totality, not only provoking us but also controlling our response to the provocation. This is an important point to note because it's often missed by those who believe that there are a few good whites. Sure, there are a few good whites, just as there are few bad blacks. However, what we are concerned here with is group attitudes and group politics. The exception does not make a lie of the rule, it merely substantiates it. The overall analysis, therefore, based on the Hegelian theory of dialectical materialism is as follows. That since the thesis is a white racism, there can only be one valid antithesis, i.e. a solid black unity to counterbalance the scale. If South Africa is to be a land where black and white live together in harmony without fear of group exploitation, it is only when those two opposites have interplayed and produced a viable synthesis of ideas and a modus vivendi. We can never wage any struggle without offering a strong counterpoint to the white races that permeate our society so effectively. One must immediately dispel the thought that black consciousness is merely a methodology or a means towards an end. What black consciousness seeks to do is to produce at the output end of the process real black people who do not regard themselves as appendages to white society. This truth cannot be reversed. We do not need to apologize for this. It is true that the white systems have produced through the world a number of people who are not aware that they too are people. Our adherence to values that we set for ourselves can also not be reversed because it will always be a lie to accept white values as necessarily the best. The fact that a synthesis may be attained only relates to adherence to power politics. Someone, somewhere along the line will be forced to accept the truth, and here we believe that ours is the truth. The future of South Africa in the case where blacks adopt black consciousness is the subject for concern, especially among initiates. What do we do when we have attained our consciousness? Do we propose to kick out whites? I believe personally that the answers to these questions ought to be found in the Sasso Policy Manifesto and in our analysis of the situation in South Africa. We have defined what we mean by true integration, and the very fact that such a definition exists does illustrate what our standpoint is. In any case, we are much more concerned about what is happening now than what will happen in the future. The future will always be shaped by the sequence of present-day events. The importance of black solidarity to the various segments of the black community must not be understated. There have been in the past a lot of suggestions that there can be no viable unity amongst blacks because they hold each other in contempt. Coloureds, despite Africans, because they, the former, by their proximity to the Africans, may lose the chances of assimilation into the white world. Africans despise the coloureds and Indians for a variety of reasons. Indians not only despise Africans, but in many instances also exploit the Africans in job and shop situations. All these stereotype attitudes have led to mountainous intergroup suspicion amongst the blacks. What we should at all times look at is the fact that 1. We are all oppressed by the same system. 2. That we are oppressed to varying degrees as a deliberate design to stratify us not only socially but in terms of aspirations. 3. Therefore, it is to be expected that in terms of enemies' plans, there must be the suspicion, and that if we are committed to the problem of emancipation to the same degree, it is part of our duty to bring to the attention of the black people the deliberateness of the enemy's subjugation scheme. 4. That we should go on with our program, attracting to it only committed people and not just those eager to seek an equitable distribution of groups amongst our ranks. This is a game common amongst liberals. The one criterion that must govern all of our actions is commitment. Further implications of black consciousness are to do with correcting false images of ourselves in terms of culture, education, religion, economics. The importance of this also must not be understated. There is always an interplay between the history of a people, i.e. the past, and their faith in themselves and hopes for their future. We are aware of the terrible role played by our education and religion in creating amongst us a false understanding of ourselves. We must therefore work out schemes not only to correct this, but further to be our own authorities rather than to wait to be interpreted by others. Whites can only see us from the outside, and as such can never extract and analyze the ethos in the black community. In summary, therefore, one need only to refer this House to the Sasso Policy Manifesto, which carries most of the salient points in the definition of black consciousness. I wish to stress again the need for us to know very clearly what we mean by certain terms and what our understanding is when we talk of black consciousness. End of quote. Fascinating stuff, very relevant to, the broad struggle of racialized, oppressed, colonized people across the world in the 60s and still very much today. If you look at the situation, for example, in Britain, in the way that oppressed, racialized communities are divided, are in a state of utter apathy and acceptance of their inferiorized, enforced condition, you can see that the words of Steve Biko and his black consciousness strategy is very relevant to the working class struggle here and across the world. And at its time, as was aforementioned before the quote, Steve Biko's leadership really helped to radicalize the movement, give confidence to the black masses, and develop a black united front, as he includes in his black liberation movement and the black consciousness definition. He includes so-called coloreds and Indians as well. And Steve Biko very much was fighting a class struggle to overthrow the apartheid regime and its neo-colonial backers for a socialist state to overcome racism. Really fascinating things. We're going to continue to research on Steve Biko and share. Please do continue supporting us, give us feedback. Please do share these videos. Really important histories and advocacy and a research center here at Counter Narrative News. Many thanks.